Deep in the dense woods of a small, forgotten town stood the decaying remains of Funland Adventure Park. Once filled with the echoes of children's laughter, the park had long since been silenced by tragedy. Decades ago, in the 1980s, a little girl named Emily had met a terrible fate there, falling from the carousel in a horrific accident. Since that day, the park had been shut down, left to rot, swallowed by nature and fear. But the town hadn't forgotten. Legends whispered of eerie happenings, strange noises in the dead of night, and the unmistakable sound of a carousel spinning. Despite there being no power for years, the dare one fateful night, for friends, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Emma decided to test the legend for themselves. They had heard the chilling rumors but dismissed them as nothing more than small-town ghost stories. After all, ghosts weren't real, right? With flashlights in hand, they made their way through the rusted gates, the hinges screeching like a warning. The air inside the park was thick, not just with dust, but with an unshakable feeling of being watched. The ride stood frozen in time, covered in vines and rust, but one thing stood out: the carousel. Unlike everything else, it wasn't still. It was spinning slowly, silently, and icy chill ran down Sarah's spine. "There's no way that thing should be moving," she whispered. Then, they heard it, a child's soft giggle echoing through the night. "Come play with me." The voice was sweet, almost innocent, but something about it was deeply wrong. Their blood ran cold as they turned toward the carousel. Sitting atop one of the faded wooden horses was a little girl in an old-fashioned dress. Her head tilted, her lifeless eyes locked onto them, and then she vanished. The terror begins. Did you guys see that?" Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike, always the fearless one, stepped closer. "It's just a trick, maybe the wind or something." Before anyone could stop him, he climbed onto the carousel. The moment his feet touched the platform, the ride began to spin faster and faster. What started as a slow, eerie turn became a violent blur of motion. Mike screamed, trying to jump off, but his body wouldn't move, as if invisible hands were gripping him, forcing him down. "Mike, get off!" Jake yelled, reaching out. Mike's eyes were wide with terror. I can't." Then he screamed again, not in fear, but in pain. Long, deep scratches appeared in his arms, as if small, clawed fingers were breaking through his skin. Emma and Sarah grabbed him, yanking him free just as the carousel came to a screeching halt in silence. But the damage was done. Mike stood there, gasping, his arms covered in fresh, bleeding scratches. She didn't want me to leave. That was enough. Without another word, the four friends bolted, never daring to look back. The legend lies on this day. Locals refuse to go near Funland Adventure Park after dark. And if you ever find yourself in those woods at night, listen carefully. You might hear the carousel creaking, spinning on its own. You might hear the whisper of a child's laughter. And if you're not careful, Emily might invite you to play. Massive frame silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For decades, it hadn't moved. Not since the disappearance. Years ago, a couple had boarded the Ferris wheel for what should have been a simple, romantic ride. But when the wheel stopped, they were gone. No bodies, no clues, just an empty gondola swaying in the wind. The town never spoke of it again, but the Ferris wheel remained, untouched and unmoving. The dare one cold evening, a group of urban explorers, Tom, Rachel, Liam, and Ava, arrived at the park, their flashlights cutting through the eerie darkness. They had heard the rumors but laughed them off. It was just an abandoned amusement park, right? As they wandered through the desolate grounds, they felt an unsettling silence settle around them. No wind, no animals, just emptiness. Then they saw it, the Ferris wheel, and it was moving point one of the gondolas, swaying gently, as if something or someone was inside. Ava shivered. "Did you see that?" Liam grinned, trying to hide his unease. "Probably just the wind." But there was no wind. Driven by both curiosity and fear, they stepped closer. The gondola creaked as if inviting them in, and they made the worst mistake of their lives, trapped the moment they stepped inside. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the park. The Ferris wheel came to life, creaking, moaning, turning. Rachel gasped. "No, no, no! This thing hasn't worked in years." Before they could react, the gondola doors slammed shut with an unnatural force. The wheel spun higher and higher, lifting them into the night sky. A freezing chill filled the air inside the gondola, seeping into their skin. And then came the whispers, soft at first, then louder, unintelligible, surrounding them. Ava screamed, spinning around, but there was nothing there. Yet they could all feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. Tom's breath hitched. "We need to get off this thing, now." But the Ferris wheel didn't stop. Not until they reached the very top. The shadows below from above, they could see the entire park, silent, lifeless. But then figures, dark, unmoving, staring up at them. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. Who are they?" The figures tilted their heads in unison, as if they had heard her. Then they moved, not walking, crawling, climbing. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, clawing their way up the metal beams of the Ferris wheel. Closer, closer. The group screamed as the first figure's hand, long skeletal fingers, grasped the edge of their gondola. Liam kicked at it, but his foot went right through, as if the thing wasn't fully solid. Yet somehow it was still coming for them. Desperate, they fought to pry the doors open. Rachel sobbed. "We have to jump." They had no other choice. One by one, they leaped, crashing onto the platform below, bruised but alive. But the Ferris will never stop turning, and as they fled the park, the whispers followed. The legend lives on the next day. The group refused to speak about what happened. They never returned. But those who pass by the amusement park at night swear they can still hear it. The Ferris wheel creaking, slowly turning on its own. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers, too. The shadows are still waiting, still searching for their next passengers. In the heart of a long-forgotten amusement park, where rusted rides groaned under the weight of time, stood the crazy carnival funhouse. Once the park's most thrilling attraction. But beneath the flashing lights and playful laughter, darkness lurked. In the 1970s, visitors entered the funhouse and never came out. Their disappearances remained a mystery, and the attraction was sealed shut, its vibrant exterior fading into decay. The town whispered about the cursed funhouse. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said it was alive, and no one dared to enter, until one night. The Daria group of reckless teenagers, Ethan, Lily, Max, and Sophie, stood before the abandoned funhouse, its faded sign barely legible. "Just a stupid haunted house," Max scoffed. "Let's prove there's nothing to be afraid of." Lily hesitated, staring at the peeling paint and the eerie silence surrounding the structure. Something felt wrong, but they had already stepped inside. Trapped the moment they crossed the threshold. A loud bang echoed behind them. The doors slammed shut, locked. Panic flickered in Sophie's eyes. That wasn't the wind. A cold shiver ran through Ethan as he looked around. The air was heavy, suffocating. The dimly lit mirrors distorted their reflections. Elongated limbs, hollowed eyes, grotesque, twisted versions of themselves. Then, they heard it. Footsteps. Light. Slow. Right behind them. Max spun around, his flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a whisper. The clowns' wake up. The funhouse wasn't empty. The painted clown statues that lined the halls were different now. Their heads had turned slightly. Their frozen grins stretched wider. Their eyes followed them. Sophie whimpered. "They weren't looking at us before." A low, crackling laugh filled the corridor. Then, the clowns moved. The nightmare maze. Ethan grabbed Lily's hand. Run! They sprinted through the corridors, mirrors reflecting their own twisted nightmares back at them. The funhouse was shifting, hallways stretching longer, doors vanishing, mirrors trapping them in endless loops. Sophie tripped, gasping. Guys, where's Max? They turned. Max was gone. Just gone. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. The laughter grew louder, one by one. They disappeared, until only Lily remained. The final escape. She ran blindly. Her heart beat a drum against her ribs. Then, a door, her fingers clawed at the handle. Unlocked, Lily stumbled out into the night, collapsing onto the cold pavement. Panting, she turned back. The funhouse was silent, but the mirrors inside were not empty. She saw them, Ethan, Max, Sophie, their faces frozen in terror, their hands pressed against the glass, screaming soundlessly, trapped. The legend lives on the crazy carnival funhouse remains locked to this day. But sometimes, if you walk by at night, you'll hear the laughter, and if you look closely into the cracked mirrors, you might see them, still waiting to be saved. Or worse, they might see you. In the heart of an abandoned amusement park, where rusted rides stood like ghosts of the past, loomed the Thunderbolt coaster. Once the crown jewel of the park, it had thrilled thousands, until tragedy struck, a fatal accident. Cart that never returned. Lives lost, never recovered. After that night, the park shut down. The coaster stood still, untouched for years, its towering tracks swallowed by vines and decay. But the legend lived on. They said the spirits of the lost never left. The dare one night, a group of reckless thrill seekers, Jake, Ryan, Mia, and Emily, stood before the haunted coaster, flashlights trembling in their hands. "This is insane," Mia whispered, staring at the rusting tracks. "This thing hasn't worked in years." Jake smirked. "Only one way to find out." The wind howled through the empty park, but against all logic, the coaster stood waiting. As if it knew they were coming, the ride begins. They climbed into the carts, dust settling around them. The control panel was dead. No power, no operator. Then, click, the safety bars slammed down on their laps. A metallic groan echoed through the night. And before they could react, the ride moved, without power, without control. A ride with the dead. The coaster jerked forward, crawling up the first massive incline. Chains rattled beneath them, though no motors ran. Ryan gripped the bar, his knuckles white. "This isn't possible." Then the drop. The carts plunged, screaming through the tracks at impossible speed, faster than any coaster should. Wind roared in their ears, but it carried something else. Whispers, laughter, screams from those who had ridden before them. Mia's sobs were lost in the deafening rush. The tracks twisted, loops appearing where there should be none. Shadows moved alongside them, unseen hands brushing their skin. The ride was never supposed to run again, but something wanted them here. The vanishing, then darkness. The cart screeched to a stop at the final platform. The safety bars lifted. They gasped for air, shaking, hearts hammering. But then Mia turned, her face draining of color. "Where's Ryan?" They spun around. His cart was empty. Panic clawed at Jake's throat. "He was right next to me. He was just here." Emily staggered back, eyes wide. Ryan's seatbelt was still locked, but he was gone. No sign of him. No sound. Nothing. The aftermath. They scrambled off the ride, sprinting into the night. They never spoke of it again. Ryan was never found. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the park, people swear they hear his screams, trapped on the coaster that never stops. And if you stand too close to the tracks, you might feel a cold hand pull you forward. Because the Thunderbolt coaster is always waiting for its next passenger. Roller coaster ghost. Once, the Tunnel of Love was the heart of the amusement park. A gentle, dreamlike ride where couples floated through candlelit waters, surrounded by painted cherubs and soft music. Laughter and whispered promises filled the air. But then, the disappearances began. At first, it was just rumors. Couple entered the ride, but never came out. Some claimed to hear screams echoing through the tunnel when no one was inside. Others swore they saw a lone shadowy figure sitting in the empty boats, its glowing red eyes staring through the darkness. The ride was shut down, boarded up, forgotten. But something remained inside, waiting. The dare years later, on a cold autumn night, a young couple, Ethan and Claire, stood before the decaying ride. The entrance was covered in vines, its painted hearts faded and cracked. "This is a bad idea," Claire whispered, shivering as she held Ethan's arm. Ethan smirked. "Come on, babe, it's just a ride. Nothing's gonna happen." The boat rocked as they climbed in. The water was ice cold, even though the night was warm. The ride groaned to life, though there was no power, and the tunnel swallowed them whole. The darkness inside, the air inside was heavy, thick with damp rot. The painted cherubs on the walls were peeling. Their innocent smiles cracked into eerie grins. The water sloshed quietly against the boat. Then, a ripple, a soft splash. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm. "Did you hear that?" The boat rocked, ever so slightly. Ethan turned to reassure her, but he froze. There, in the boat beside them, sat a figure. Its form was draped in shadows, its edges blurred like smoke. It had no face, only two glowing red eyes, burning through the darkness, watching, waiting. The cold touch of the dead Claire screamed as the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, its bony fingers stretched toward them, too long, too thin. The air turned freezing. Claire's breath came out in mist. Ethan grabbed her hand. "Jump!" They plunged into the icy water. Darkness swallowed them, closing in like hands reaching from the depths. Claire kicked desperately, her heart hammering in terror. Above her, she saw Ethan's pale face, eyes wide with fear. Then, a hand burst from the water. Not Ethan's, thin, skeletal, clawed fingers curling around his ankle. A choked scream. Ethan thrashed, yanking free, and they both scrambled onto the dock, gasping for air. When they looked back, the boat was empty. The water was still, but deep within the tunnel, two red eyes burned like embers in the night. Watching, waiting, the legend lives on. Ethan and Claire made it out alive, but something in them had changed. They never spoke of that night, never returned. But the tunnel of love remains, still abandoned, still waiting. Some say if you listen closely at night, you can hear the soft sloshing of water, the creak of an empty boat. And if you get too close to the entrance, you might see him sitting in the last boat, staring. And if he reaches for you, don't let him touch you, because no one knows where the others went, and you don't want to find out. In a forgotten corner of town, where weeds strangled rusting rides and silence hung heavy in the air, stood the merry-go-round. Once the heart of the amusement park, it had twirled with laughter and music, carrying children in endless circles of joy. But one night, that laughter turned to screams. A group of children boarded the ride. The music played, the horses galloped in their endless dance, and when the ride stopped, the children were gone. No one saw them leave. No one heard their cries. The park shut down, swallowed by fear and time. The merry-go-round stood still, untouched for decades, but the town whispered of strange things, of flickering lights, of ghostly music drifting through the night. Of eyes watching from the hollow stares of painted horses. The dare one night, a group of friends, Emma, Lucas, Nate, and Sarah, stood at the rusting gates of the abandoned park. "Come on," Lucas grinned. "It's just an old ride. What's the worst that could happen?" Emma hesitated. Something about the way the wind carried the scent of rotting wood made her stomach twist, but they stepped forward anyway. The air grew colder as they approached the merry-go-round. The horses stood frozen, their chipped paint revealing hollow, black mouths. Their eyes, wide, unblinking, seemed to follow the group's every move. Then, The music began to play slow, off-key. The once cheerful melody now a distorted wail, and the merry-go-round began to spin. The haunting ride, the wind howled as the ride moved faster. Emma's heart pounded. We should leave, but something pulled them forward. Not a hand, not a voice, just an unseen, irresistible force point one by one. They climbed onto the horses, their legs moving against their will. The moment they touched the cold, worn reins, the world around them shifted. The horses' faces twisted, their painted smiles stretching into grotesque grins. Their eyes darkened into endless voids. Lucas screamed. Nate tried to let go, but their hands wouldn't move. The ride spun faster. The music shrieked. The world blurred into a storm of color and shadows. Then, darkness, silence. The sole survivor the next morning, park security found Emma. She wandered near the entrance, her hair tangled, her eyes vacant, muttering, shaking. She spoke only 2 words, again and again. The other side, the other side, the other side. Her friends were never found. The merry-go-round stood still once more, but at night, when the wind carries faint echoes of laughter and the distant chime of a music box, some say it waits for more riders, for its next victims. And if you ever hear that haunting melody in the dead of night, don't turn around, because something might already be watching. Carousel Horse Kitchen Knife Eye. In the heart of the abandoned amusement park, where rusted rides loomed like forgotten skeletons, stood the sky-high swings. Once, they soared above the park, carrying riders into the sky, their laughter echoing through the wind. But one night, that laughter turned to screams at a malfunction. Chains snapping like brittle bones, riders plummeting like broken dolls. Some never made it back. The swings were shut down, left to rot. But even after the ride was dismantled, whispers spread through town, of screams that echoed when the wind was still, of ghostly figures swinging in the night air, and of a ride that refused to be forgotten. The dare one fateful night, for teenagers, Ava, Jake, Liam, and Sophia stood before the remains of the sky-high swings. Only the rusted frame remained, the seats long gone. The wind carried a strange chill, even though the night was warm. "This is so stupid," Sophia whispered, hugging her arms. "People died here." Jake grinned, trying to mask his unease. "It's just a legend. Besides, there's nothing left of the ride." "What's the worst that could happen?" Ava shivered. The air felt wrong. "Fine," Liam said. "Let's sit where the swings used to be. If we last 5 minutes, we win." The ride begins. The group spread out, sitting on invisible swings, their feet barely touching the ground. The wind picked up, then the chains rattled, the metal creaked, groaned, as if unseen forces pulled at it before they could react. They lifted off the ground. Ava gasped as an invisible force yanked her higher. Her heart pounded against her ribs. There was no seat, no chains, yet something was carrying them upward. They weren't alone. The ghostly rider's Liam turned to call out to Jake, but Jake wasn't there anymore. Instead, a figure swung beside him, a pale, twisted face, frozen in agony, empty eyes locked onto him. Sophia screamed. She saw them too, dozens of ghostly figures swinging beside them, their bodies weightless, their mouths twisted in eternal, soundless wails. Ava thrashed, struggling against the force holding her in place. "Let us down!" The swings went higher, faster. The wind roared, filled with the voices of the dead. Then, a snap. The false Sophia's swing vanished beneath her. She plummeted. The air rushed past her, her scream swallowed by the night. Then silence. The impact never came. When her friends rushed to her side, she was lying on the ground, unharmed. But her wide, tear-filled eyes stared at something only she could see. "They were there," she whispered, "swinging beside us. They never left." The aftermath, the teenagers fled, never speaking of that night again. The park finally tore down the last remains of the sky-high swings. But it didn't matter. On quiet nights, if you stand where the swings once stood, you might hear the metal chains rattling, the distant echoes of laughter. And if you listen closely, you might hear the screams. Because some rides never stop, and some riders never get off. Carousel Horse Ghost. In the heart of the abandoned amusement park, where laughter had long since faded and rusted rides groaned in the wind, stood a forgotten popcorn stand. Its once bright paint had chipped away, revealing the rotting wood beneath. The glass display case was cracked, its insides coated with dust and something darker. Something that looked like old, dried blood. But the legend was far more disturbing than its appearance. They said that decades ago, Mr. Jenkins, the friendly old popcorn vendor, had died of a heart attack right behind the counter, his body slumped over the machine. But he never truly left. Visitors swore they had seen a shadowy figure behind the counter, staring with hollow eyes. Some claimed the scent of fresh popcorn would drift through the air at night, only for the smell to change, turning into something foul, something rotten. The dare one cold October night, for friends, Mark, Emily, Jason, and Olivia, stood before the rotting stand, their flashlights flickering. "This is so stupid," Olivia muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's just an old story." Jason smirked. "Then go say hi to Mr. Jenkins." Mark, the bravest of them all, grinned. "Fine, I'll check it out." As they stepped closer, the air thickened. A sickly sweet smell, like burnt sugar and something decaying, filled their nostrils. Then, Poppy, the unmistakable sound of popcorn popping broke the silence. Poppy, the machine, rusted and dead for years, suddenly came to life, and standing behind the counter was Mr. Jenkins. A taste of terror. His figure was draped in shadows, but his face, it was wrong. His skin was ashen, stretched too tight over his bones. His lips were cracked, twisted into a grin that didn't belong on a dead man. His hollow eyes locked onto them, gleaming with an unnatural light. Without a word, he reached down and lifted a bag of popcorn. His hand trembled as he held it out. "Go on," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "Take it." Mark, heart pounding, reached out. His fingers brushed the bag, warm and slightly greasy. He swallowed hard and forced himself to look inside. A scream built in his throat. Maggots, wriggling, fat, white maggots crawling over burnt, blackened popcorn. The smell hit him, rancid, putrid, like something long dead. He dropped the bag, stumbling back. "Run!" The final glance, they bolted, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air grew colder, the sound of popping growing louder behind them. But Mark, he made a mistake. He looked back. Mr. Jenkins was still there, but his face had changed. His grin stretched wider, splitting his cheeks open. His hollow eyes burned like embers, and he whispered something. Though Mark couldn't hear the words, he felt them slither into his bones. The cursed lives. On the next morning, Mark was found dead in his bed. His face was twisted in a silent scream. His hands clutched at his throat, his mouth stuffed full of burnt popcorn. The stand remains abandoned. No one dares go near it. But some nights, if you stand too close, you might hear the faint sound of kernels popping. And if you ever smell burnt popcorn, run. Because Mr. Jenkins is still waiting, and he's hungry. Popcorn fire. In the heart of the abandoned amusement park stood the Hall of Mirrors. Once a place of wonder, where laughter bounced off the glass walls, it now sat in eerie silence, its entrance sealed shut. But the town remembered. They whispered about the visitors who had entered, only to never return. About reflections that moved when they shouldn't. About eyes staring back that weren't their own. Some said the mirrors held more than just reflections. They held souls. The dare one chilly autumn night, for friends, Ethan, Lily, Jordan, and Mia stood outside the boarded-up entrance. The air was thick with decay, the wind carrying a faint whisper like distant laughter. "This place is just an old legend," Ethan said, forcing a grin. Come on, it's just glass and light. Lily hesitated, biting her lip. Then why did they seal it shut? Jordan, always the risk-taker, pulled away a loose board. Only one way to find out. They stepped inside. The illusion begins the moment the door shut behind them. The air grew heavy. The mirrors stretched in every direction, multiplying their reflections endlessly. First, they laughed, posing and waving. But then Lily gasped. Did you see that? Her reflection had just blinked. But she hadn't. Mia stepped closer to a mirror. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed, unblinking. And then it smiled. Mia's stomach clenched. She hadn't smiled. The others noticed too. Their reflections shifted unnaturally, smiling when they weren't, turning their heads when they stood still. Then, the lights flickered and went out. The trapped reflections panic set in. Their breath came in short gasps as the darkness swallowed them. The only light came from the dim, ghostly glow of the mirrors. Then, the whispers began at a low, echoing murmur that wasn't their own voices. Shadowed figures flickered in the glass, stepping closer with each blink. Guys, where's the exit? Jordan's voice wavered. They ran, hands outstretched, but the mirrors twisted around them, shifting and changing. The corridors stretched into infinity, leading them in endless loops. Then, Mia screamed. They turned just in time to see her being pulled into a mirror. Her hands clawing at the glass, her reflection smiled, and she was gone. One by one, panic turned to terror. They ran faster, their screams bouncing off the glass walls. Jordan vanished next, his reflection stepping forward, replacing him as his real body disappeared. Then Lily, her voice cutting off as she was swallowed by the glass. Only Ethan remained. The survivor, his breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled forward, his hands pressed against the cold mirrors. Then, an opening. The exit. He lunged for it, throwing himself outside. Cold night air hit his skin like a slap. He was free, shaking. He turned back and froze. His friends were in the mirrors, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. Their hands pounded against the glass, begging to be freed, and behind them, the shadowy figures watched, smiling. The legend lives on the Hall of Mirrors was sealed shut the next morning. No one dared enter again. But some nights, if you stand near the boarded entrance, you might hear the echoes of distant screams. And if you ever see your reflection smile when you didn't run, because some reflections don't belong to you anymore. A ghost. A train ride to the other side. Deep in the heart of the abandoned amusement park, where rusted tracks vanished into the fog, sat the spooky express. Once, it had thrilled visitors, taking them through eerie tunnels and haunted landscapes. But then, the crash. A fatal collision. Screams that never faded. The ride shut down. The park was abandoned, but the legend remained. Some nights, people claimed to hear a distant train whistle. Others swore they saw ghostly passengers boarding a train that shouldn't exist. The dare one moonless night, for friends, Ryan, Jess, Alex, and Sam, stood before the decaying station. The faded sign still read, "Locomotive all aboard the spooky express." Locomotive. Ryan chuckled nervously. "It's just a ride, right?" Jess crossed her arms. "Then why is it still here?" Alex, the skeptic, smirked. "Because people love making up ghost stories." Sam swallowed hard. "Then let's prove them wrong." They climbed into an old, dust-covered train car, their footsteps echoing in the empty station. The air smelled of rust and something rotten. The doors slammed shut behind them. The train lurched forward, passengers in the dark as the train rolled onto the tracks. The old lights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. The friends laughed, nervously. Then, they noticed something. The seats around them, empty just moments ago, were now occupied. Dark figures sat motionless, their faces obscured by shadows. A whisper slithered through the air. Jess's breath hitched. "Guys, who are they?" No one answered. The figures didn't move, but somehow, they felt closer. The train picked up speed. The windows blurred into blackness. And then the stopa screech. The train slammed to a halt inside a tunnel. The lights went out. Everything was pitch black. Cold fingers brushed against their arms. Something whispered their names. Ryan gasped, trying to steady his breath. Who's there? A voice, soft, raspy, not human, whispered back, passengers. Then, a scream. Jess's gone. The lights flickered back on. Jess's seat was empty. Only her phone remained. Its screen cracked. A final text half-typed. They see us. The dark figures were gone. The train jolted forward. Ryan, Alex, and Sam panicked, scrambling toward the doors. The tunnel walls blurred past, filled with faces, watching, grinning, waiting. They saw daylight ahead. The jump without thinking. They leaped from the train, hitting the ground hard. Scrapes and bruises burned against their skin, but they didn't stop running. When they turned back, the train was gone. No sound. No tracks, just an empty tunnel, sealed off by rubble. Jess was never found. The legend lives on the Spooky Express remains abandoned, its station swallowed by time. But on some nights, a train whistle cuts through the silence, and if you listen closely, you might hear the screech of brakes. Or the whispers of lost passengers. And if you ever board a train that wasn't there before, hold on tight, because some passengers never leave. Locomotive Ghost.